So welcome. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Kristen Jackson. I'm the Digital Outreach Manager with the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is the state's largest environmental advocacy organization. We are based in Augusta on the unceded territory of the Penobscot Indian Nation. And NRCM harnesses the power of science, the law, and the voices of people who value Maine's environment to protect the nature of Maine. And so today you are here to hear from us about the future of Maine's electric grid. And before we dive in and I introduce my speakers, I just want to do a couple of quick housekeeping items. So the first is that closed captioning is available for today's event from your bottom menu. You can turn on captions. If you have any questions about how to do that, feel free to send me a chat and I'm happy to help you out. We will also be recording this webinar and posting it on NRCM's YouTube channel. So we typically send that out to everyone who is registered. And again, it'll be available on YouTube. If you have questions for our speakers throughout the presentation, it's best to drop them in the Q&A box. That's again down on the bottom of your menu screen. You can also put them in the chat box. They just might get lost as people put in more chat. So again, if you really want your question answered, the best place to put it is in the Q&A box. And if you have any technical difficulties throughout the presentation, feel free to send me a direct chat. Again, it's Kristen Jackson with NRCM. So without further ado, we're going to hear some introductions from our speakers. First, Rebecca, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Rebecca Schultz, and I'm a senior advocate for climate and clean energy with the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Next up, Steve.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Clemmer. I'm the Director of Energy Research and Analysis in the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I am based in Prospect Harbor up on the Scotia Peninsula. Good to see everyone, or hear everyone, or whatever is going to happen today. Thanks.
All right, and my name is Jack Shapiro. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director here at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. And I think I'm going to go ahead and proceed to an outline of our presentation this morning. So first, we're going to give a quick intro to our energy transition and how grid planning fits in, why this is important. We're going to talk a little bit about the new planning provisions that were passed in LD 1959 during the last legislative session. Then highlight the priorities for implementation as we see them, and give some examples of what this looks like in practice in some other states. And finally, we'll get you up to speed on the latest developments in the implementation of our new grid planning law here in Maine, what to be on the lookout for as the planning process gets up and running, and then take a bunch of time for questions as well. Next slide. All right, so taking a step back, just so that we are all starting from the same place, we have to recognize that for the past few centuries, our entire economy has been built on fossil fuels, especially where we get our energy. So generating electricity has mostly come from coal, oil, and gas. How we heat our homes has, good amount came from coal at one point, and now sort of utility gas, propane, and oil are some of the big ways that we do that. Transportation, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, etc. And the system has some major downsides. Not only is fossil fuel production and use destructive to our natural environment and terrible from a human health perspective, but it also is driving climate change. Next slide. So while we still have a long way to go, we are fortunate that in the past several years, around the world, around the country, and here in Maine, people and policymakers are taking climate change more seriously than ever before. And again, we still have a lot of work to do. We should not be patting ourselves on the back here. But from a technological standpoint, we actually have most of the solutions that we need available to us right now today. We have electric vehicle technology that simply outperforms old combustion vehicles in most cases. We have high efficiency heat pumps that can heat our homes in the winter, they can cool them in the summer, and they can save homeowners and business owners money while doing it. And renewable energy, like solar and wind, are the cheapest new electricity generation coming onto the grid here in New England and all around the world. So electrification is really the backbone of our state's climate action plan, and switching how we heat our homes and businesses, fuel our cars and trucks from fossil fuels to electricity. And that has a ton of benefits. It's less polluting. We're not exposed to the price volatility that's impacting so many Maine families right now. It has fewer impacts and is more affordable over time. Next slide. But electrification and switching away from fossil fuels has really profound implications for our electricity system and our electric grid. So in the electrified renewable world that we are envisioning, we're going to see electricity demand double or triple as our heating needs electricity, as how we charge up those electric vehicles will need electricity. We're going to see that instead of a few dozen large power plants or ramping up and down to meet the electric needs of homes and businesses, we're going to see tens of thousands of renewable energy projects of all scales generating clean power, from rooftops in a neighborhood to large offshore wind farms, to garage batteries, to larger storage systems. Instead of several hundred gas stations all along Maine's roads across the state, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles plugged into the grid. And some of those batteries could charge when renewable energy is being produced in abundance. Instead of tanker trucks filling up oil tanks in people's basements, we're going to have heat pumps and heat pump water heaters that could respond to the needs of the grid and help keep costs low for everyone. So the takeaway here, next slide, is that making this transition to an electrified economy powered by renewable energy is going to require a once-in-a-century reimagining of our electric grid. And to do that reimagining, we're going to have to bring in a lot more voices than just the utilities themselves, who traditionally are the ones that sort of make the decisions about what kinds of investments are needed. There is a ton of investment needed. And if we make those choices poorly, we're going to have an expensive, poorly thought out grid that puts the profits of utilities at the center of investment decisions. But if we do it right, we could have a low-cost, high-performing grid that's flexible, that's resilient, that incorporates renewable energy and distributed resources, and really puts the needs of Maine people first. So this transition isn't just coming, it's already underway. We've tripled solar power in Maine in the last few years. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. We're on track to install the 100,000th heat pump in Maine in the next few years. And major efforts like the huge climate investments that are in the Inflation Reduction Act are just going to speed things along. So integrated grid planning is the process that will bring together the climate and clean energy obligations and opportunities we've laid out for ourselves as a state, with forecasts of energy needs, scenarios for deploying energy efficiency and distributed clean energy resources like those solar panels and those batteries. And it's going to integrate that with detailed data about how our transmission and distribution systems are being used over time, over the course of a day, over the course of a year, how they're being used geographically across the state. And it uses a much more open and participatory process to really ensure we're getting the best ideas, the best thinking, the best innovations, and unlocking the most benefits for Maine people from this energy transition that's happening all around us. So we're really happy to have worked on and been part of passing the integrated grid planning bill here in Maine earlier this year, LD 1959. And we think it really has the potential to put us on the right path And to talk more about that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for laying the landscape like that, Jack. Integrated grid planning had really been something that stakeholders have been recommending for years to help accelerate Maine's climate goals. So like Jack said, when an opportunity presented itself in the last legislative session with the governor's energy bill, a bunch of environmental advocates jumped on board to add an amendment to that bill requiring grid planning. So that law is LD 1959, and I'll just highlight a couple of the things that it does. It requires Maine's two big utilities, the Central Maine Power CMP and Versant, to develop 10-year plans to meet the state's climate and greenhouse gas reduction requirements. So that alone is a pretty big deal. And then every 5 years, there'll be a broad public stakeholder process to set the planning objectives and to help put the priorities of Maine people front and center. And the law also includes a lot of very specific requirements to help force transparency and inclusiveness. These include, for instance, assumptions around heat pumps and electric vehicles and solar and storage. Oh, yep, that's right. That's the right one.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. So these are assumptions around adoption rates for heat pumps and EVs and solar and all these critical technologies that we need to really accelerate the clean energy transition to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. Another really important part is that it requires an assessment of the equity and environmental justice impacts of grid plans. Now, this is a first in the nation requirement. We're really excited about this. No other state has an EJ impact assessment requirement at this stage in the power sector planning process. So that's a really exciting opportunity that I want to flag for you and that we want to be thinking about how to maximize and take advantage of as we move through this process. Next slide. So, you know, as detailed as some of these planning provisions are, there's still a lot that's left to the discretion of the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, when it comes to implementation. So we spent the summer, NRCM and the Union of Concerned Scientists, along with other NGO partners, trying to keep energy decision makers really focused on implementation. And we've been emphasizing 3 priority areas. Firstly, that we want to see robust, meaningful, inclusive stakeholder input through, on the one hand, really broad public conversations to bring new voices to the table, but also through ongoing oversight and information sharing in these fast-moving technology and policy spaces. And secondly, you know, whatever the model of stakeholder engagement ultimately looks like, success is going to depend in large part on having independent technical expertise as a counterweight to the utilities to help challenge and vet the information that they put forth. And then thirdly, we've been emphasizing a need for supporting research and analysis to help level the playing field, reduce the barriers to access, to build a common understanding on key issues, to steer the conversation and build consensus. You know, to illustrate these priorities, we should look to other states to see what this looks like in practice. And so I'll pass it off to Steve here to talk about some examples from other states.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks again to NRCM for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So the good news is that Maine doesn't have to start from scratch in developing its grid planning process. There are lots of best practices that Maine can draw on from decades of experience in other states. UCS has about 20 years of experience working on utility planning in places like California, Minnesota, Michigan, and several other states. The map on the left shows that most states had integrated resource planning requirements or a similar process in place as of 2013. That show, it's a little bit dated going back to 2013, but that shows that this has been happening for quite a while and lots of things to draw on. While these plans vary from state to state, they're typically focused on long-term investments in electricity generation and transmission by vertically integrated investor-owned utilities and some public utilities, and those investments that are needed to meet customer demand as well as state policy goals. The map on the right shows a more recent development in 26 states. Could you go back, Kristen, for a second? Thanks.
So sorry, my slides are being wonky, but
yeah,
yes,
no
here we
problem.
go.
Yeah, so the map on the right shows integrated distribution system plannings, which is a more recent development that's happening in about 26 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as of 2020. At least 6 of those states, the ones that are shown in dark blue, have established distribution plans that have been approved by public utility commissions and executed by utilities. And as you can see in comparing the two maps, there are several states that actually have both types of planning going on at the same time. And it's really important that these plans get coordinated. Some of the similarities between this type of planning is that they do have similar and overlapping data needs with respect to forecasting electricity demand, the role that energy efficiency or solar distributed energy resources play. Those usually come into play in both kinds of plannings. But there's also some key differences. And those would include things like they require different kinds of models and different kinds of data, with distribution plans typically having a much greater level of geographic and temporal granularity than the integrated resource plans. The other thing too that's important to recognize is that regulated utilities in restructured states like Maine that no longer own generation, most of those states typically do distribution plans. But it's really important to make sure that those plans are coordinated with on the generation side so that Maine and these other states are making sure that they're meeting their climate and clean energy goals. Next slide. Hawaii provides a really interesting example and a model for stakeholder engagement. They have several different kinds of stakeholder entities set up, including a stakeholder council. And that council has 20 members that represent a fairly broad range of interests, ranging from city and county representatives to clean energy developers, environmental groups, state agencies, and others. This is really similar to the group that was formed in Maine for the Maine Utility Regulatory Reform and Decarbonization Initiative process that had many of those same kinds of folks. In Hawaii, this group meets quarterly to get updates, provide feedback, and identifies priorities for the working groups. It also includes a technical advisory panel that has leading national experts that provide independent peer review of utility methodologies, assumptions, and results from the modeling. And in Hawaii, in those situations, the findings have influenced PUC decisions that the utilities have eventually have been made for the utilities. It also includes ad hoc working groups that really dig into specific topics, some of which you can see in the box there related to forecasting or resilience, integrating distributed energy resources, and so forth. I also just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of examples of some of the broad stakeholder engagement that they have. So one example is Hawaii Electric developed a input and assumptions data dashboard to really break down some of this really complicated forecasting data in a user-friendly way for customers. They also partnered with the National Renewable Energy Lab to develop interactive maps to help identify potential locations for siting renewable energy projects. And they also provide several accessible and inclusive ways for the public to engage both online and in person that we could talk about more later. Next slide, please. Another example that's pretty compelling for Minnesota is the important impact that independent modeling and technical expertise can have on utility and PUC decision-making. Xcel Energy is Minnesota's largest utility, representing about half of the state's electricity sales. It's also one of the country's largest investor-owned utilities, serving 3.7 million customers in 8 states. In Minnesota, Xcel and other utilities are required to submit integrated resource plans every 2 years to the Public Utility Commission, projecting what investments need to be made to meet electricity demands for the next 15 years. Xcel is also required to file a distribution plan And they also have a fairly robust stakeholder engagement process that Maine could learn from. It's interesting, Excel really sees itself as a clean energy leader, and it's announced really ambitious plans for retiring all its coal plants, investing in wind and solar, and reducing its carbon emissions by 80% by 2030. But despite these bold commitments, Excel's most recent plan proposed to invest $2 billion in a new 800 megawatt natural gas combined cycle plant to replace its largest coal plant, which is shown in that picture on the left. While the gas plant would have lower emissions than the coal plant, it would still represent a significant source of emissions that would make it extremely difficult for Excel and the state of Minnesota to meet their emission reduction targets, and could ultimately result in a stranded asset that consumers would have to pay for. So as part of this process, UCS was one of 4 clean energy organizations that hired an independent consultant to run the same model that Excel was using. And one thing that we discovered was Excel was actually forcing in the gas plant into the model. It was forcing the model to choose it instead of allowing the model to choose what the most cost-effective options were. So when we removed that constraint and changed a few other assumptions, we were able to identify efficiency, renewables, and storage solutions that were cheaper and cleaner than investing in the gas plant, as shown kind of in that middle bar chart there called the CEO preferred plan. At the same time, the State Energy Office was also doing its own modeling and reached very similar conclusions. The end result was that Excel removed the gas plant from its final plan approved in February of this year, and their own updated modeling showed that it would save ratepayers hundreds of millions of dollars and achieve additional carbon reductions. This experience shows that utility plans can evolve, and having stakeholders with resources and access to modeling is important to illuminate different options and identify places where utility assumptions could be improved. I think, next slide, I think I'll pass it back to Rebecca to talk about some of the things that could be included in distribution system planning. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. That's such an awesome example of how valuable transparency is to this process to allow alternate interpretations of the modeling and the assumptions to shed light on what the right path forward is. So at this point, we've talked a lot at a higher level, but I do want to highlight what this can mean on the ground. And a recent example comes from the Topsom, Brunswick area, where earlier this summer, the Public Utilities Commission here in Maine actually made some headlines when it decided to move forward with an alternative to a conventional utility proposal. So similar sort of dynamic or set of processes is what Steve has just talked about, where the utility presents an option and the public and stakeholders need to be sort of tapped and engaged and given the access to the information to come up with alternative solutions. So in this case, the commission went ahead and decided to move forward with an alternative to what the conventional utility proposal was. So instead of investing $15 million to expand a 5-mile stretch of transmission between Brunswick and Topsom, which is what the utility had proposed, the commission approved a plan to invest in a targeted bundle of investments, including energy efficiency improvements, for example, in the form of new refrigeration units at the Hannaford, battery storage sited possibly at Bowdoin College or Midcoast Hospital, and other investments to relieve stress on the grid in this very specific area. And this bundle of investments is estimated to save ratepayers $8.5 million. And this is just one section of the grid. CMP has hundreds of sections in its distribution system. So you can imagine the sort of potential savings and other sort of co-benefits of alternatives that could be identified. Another exciting part about this project in Brunswick and Topsom is that after a 2-year demonstration period, the commission's going to give the go-ahead to remove the existing lines altogether. So these are lines that otherwise would have been expanded into people's backyards, may now be removed altogether. So these are the kinds of alternatives to conventional transmission and distribution investments that grid planning will help us identify more efficiently. Yeah, go ahead and note the next slide. Thank you. Another part of this is about improving transparency, as we've discussed, to make it easier for everyone to participate in the planning and also the building of the clean energy grid. And one way this happens is through something called hosting capacity maps. So these are interactive maps that developers use to identify places on the grid to site solar projects without requiring costly upgrades. So this is a screenshot of the Lewiston-Auburn area, and you can get a sense of how this kind of tool can help inform siting decisions. It's pretty straightforward. The red indicates congestion, where there would be high costs to upgrading that little section of the grid there to accommodate solar, and the green indicates, you know, a higher degree of excess capacity on the system to accommodate new solar. CMP has only just issued its first iteration of hosting capacity maps. Versant has yet to. So the devil's in the detail, you know, how regularly these are updated, how accurate and relevant the information is, all will determine whether or not this is a very useful tool for developers or not, to help reduce costs overall, but also expedite these interconnection times. And hosting capacity maps are a component of what is required by Maine's grid planning process. Next slide. So latest developments, how to get involved, what's the latest? It's going to be a long process with a lot of opportunities to get engaged. For instance, it could be 2 years before we see a completed draft plan from CMP and Versant. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities over the course of the next several months and years. At this point, things largely sit with the Public Utilities Commission. They're required to launch the public stakeholder process this fall, but what exactly that will look like, we still don't know exactly. They've already asked for ideas and input about what the process should look like, and they're currently updating rules to make it easier to get financial assistance to participate in conversations like these. So the process will probably involve a series of educational workshops and public outreach events and meetings, both online and around the state, to help define community priorities and gather and vet information from utilities and other interested parties. So we'll know more soon about the specific timelines and opportunities to engage. And we're going to try to do our best to keep you all updated and informed on opportunities to get involved, including through joint petitions and comment letters that we plan to develop to help channel public ideas and concerns into this effort. So stay tuned. All of this depends entirely on having an active and informed, engaged public that can meaningfully participate in a transparent regulatory process. So we're really encouraged by the turnout today, and we're looking forward to question and answers now and discussion moving forward in the weeks to come as we have more of a sense of what exactly this is going to look like. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca and Jack and Steve. We have folks' contact info up here if folks have further questions, but we have plenty of time. We have about 30 minutes to dive into some of our questions. I'm going to stop the screens here so we can see everyone's faces. So we're going to start with some of the questions that we got when folks registered, but as a reminder, we have this Q&A box down at the bottom, and feel free to pop your questions in there. Some of them we'll answer live. Our speakers can also type in their answers, and you'll be able to see them on the answered side of the question and answer box. But the first question we are going to start with is, how does grid planning support environmental justice priorities in Maine? I'm not sure if that was going to be Jack or Rebecca that was going to take that one.
I'm happy to dive in. Well, I had mentioned that the law requires the utilities to submit with the plans an impact assessment of the environmental justice and equity impacts of the plan. So this is a big opportunity for us to sort of pry that open and potentially kind of set some sort of blueprint out there as to what we want that assessment to look like, how high level or how superficial, really. So, that we expect that to be a big part of the conversation here. And I think I'm encouraged by the fact that the commission has hired an outreach coordinator of some kind recently, and also seems to be putting in place these rules to give access to financial assistance to individuals and groups that could benefit from that assistance in order to participate in grid planning and other similar forums at the commission. So I think there's a big opportunity for environmental justice and equity concerns to be really centered here.
Great, thank you. We've also had a number of questions about how integrated grid planning will intersect with a potential of a consumer-owned utility. So I'm not sure who wants to answer that one. Jack, do you want to take it away?
Sure, yeah. And I think Rebecca, you can probably fill in any gaps that I have. I think the long story short is that this kind of grid planning and this grid transformation is going to need to occur no matter what the ownership model is for our utilities in Maine. So we're seeing this as a really positive step independent of the results of the campaign for the COU, and we saw that the signatures were just submitted for the for that to be on the ballot in 2023. But yeah, I think the challenge of figuring out what are the investments that will have the most benefit, that will come at the least cost, that will allow us to achieve our climate and clean energy goals, and let more people access the cost-saving technologies like electric vehicles, like heat pumps, and other things, is going to be a huge challenge no matter who's running the grid. Some of the incentives are going to be different, but regardless, this is something that is best done through a more open and participatory and transparent process, and that's the direction that that we're going with what's laid out in LD 1959, and what we're hoping the PUC will put forward as the sort of stakeholder process is the initial step here. I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I would just say that I see the utility, the consumer-owned utility, as being highly complementary to grid planning. We need this sort of reformed, participatory, reinvigorated public process, regardless of who owns the assets, as Jack said. And in some ways, if the Pine Tree Power is adopted, this could help. Having this clear plan with all of this disclosed information from the utilities could help keep our climate investments and the operational changes that need to happen on track through the impending litigation that would likely ensue. So it could be a really valuable tool to have. I'll leave it with that.
Great, thanks. So our next question, we know that with climate change will come stronger storms. And I think as Mainers, we are all too familiar with power outages and how long they can take to get back online. So maybe, Steve, you can answer this question. What are plans, or how does resiliency factor into integrated grid planning?
Yeah, it plays a big role. I think in other states, certainly that are being affected by climate change, definitely utility investments, both to harden the grid, but also to help reduce emissions and to provide kind of win-win solutions for climate resilience. Like, I think there were some other questions about microgrids. We see microgrids as a potential solution to achieve a win-win if you combine it with clean energy, because it can help avoid or limit the impacts of outages, and at the same time reduce emissions, and can be especially important for critical infrastructure like police, fire, hospitals, and et cetera. And so we see that all connected, and certainly the impacts of climate change are increasing, and we need to plan for that, and with a variety of solutions, including some of the ones that Jack and Rebecca have laid out. And so that's all part of the planning process.
Thanks. Let's see, we have a question that Jack is going to answer from Steve here. It says, do air source heat pumps qualify as a home's primary heat source yet? If not yet, when or how might they qualify?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Steve. Short answer is yes, and that actually reminds me of an article that just came out from a study that Efficiency Maine did, which I can share in the chat. But they're working increasingly on how air source heat pumps, these sort of new high efficiency heat pumps that work even in the coldest temperatures, can serve as a home's sole heat source. So I'm going to put that in the chat. It's a great article and points to a great study. But yeah, the short answer there is yes, absolutely.
Great. This next question is for you, Rebecca. We've had a couple of questions submitted both before the webinar and now about how long this process will take. I know you said it's going to be a long process. We had someone ask how long of a process. Another person asked how soon could we have an electric grid capable of handling lots of distributed solar and wind. So this might be a ballpark, it might be an estimate, but can you give a little bit of sense of timeline for people?
Yeah, I think the vision is to lay a foundation and to have an iterative process that gets revisited regularly with the kinds of, architecture that can regularly sort of be playing an oversight role to tweak this and change this and modify this based on, a war in Ukraine and escalating energy costs and all these kinds of factors that really change the underlying dynamics, never mind the Inflation Reduction Act and how these incentives are going to come in, so we need to have this kind of foundation that allows us to nimbly respond to things as they change. So it's going to be a long process. It's going to be ongoing, but the hope is to do this foundational work, this first iteration in the next couple of years, and have something we really feel strongly about and good about, both in terms of the process, because process is important, the conversations are really important, the education is really important, but also the actual plan itself and what the goals are and how we come back to those goals through quantifiable metrics to make sure that the utilities are investing in the grid of the future. So it's iterative. I would hope that in 2 years we have something really solid to be basing our immediate plans on and to call good.
Awesome. This question may have been answered during the presentation, but I think it's a good one to point to. Someone's asking, how are we going to get the expertise that we need for this? Do the power companies have it? It seems like they have a lot of the power here. How are we making sure this is done right?
I can try to take that one. As I was describing with some of the examples from other states, I think, bringing in, well, first of all, I think there's a lot of expertise here in Maine that can be tapped into. The example I gave of the Maine Utility Regulatory Reform and Decarbonization Initiative, MERDI, is an example of that. But there's other examples through let's say the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan working groups. There's just a lot of expertise. But in addition to that, there's also some national expertise from the national labs. I mentioned NREL's involvement in Hawaii, for example, the National Renewable Energy Lab, but also Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has a lot of resources too to help states with resource planning and distribution system planning. In fact, they did just in the past year, they did a big event with several New England states to help train them on this topic. So there are a lot of resources to tap into and a lot of experience and expertise from around the country that could be leveraged here in Maine.
Awesome, thanks, Steve. Jack, I think I saw you starting to just type an answer to this, but I think it might be one that folks are curious about. What about security of our electric grid? Gina asked, the hacking of electric grids becomes harder to control unless all grids have high security. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think, I think cybersecurity is super important. I think especially as we see more of the devices that we use be connected to the internet, like a smart thermostat, or or any of these other devices, a EV car charger or an EV itself, or heat pumps or heat pump water heaters and other control systems. That's not the primary focus of the integrated grid planning process, but it's certainly a really important thing to raise, and really important to ensure that not just the utilities, but also the commission as the regulators. And it's something that goes far beyond Maine as well, in terms of the kinds of things that the private companies and service providers that are building out these technologies need to really be aware of. But I think it's a really great flag.
Awesome, thanks. I am just digging through our questions to figure out what we're going to ask next. Let's see, Jim St. Pierre asks, high voltage lines have a big impact. Where can we see a map of where transmission lines could be removed in Brunswick Topton? What other lines in Maine also may be removed?
There is no such map, because that kind of evaluation requires a really a detailed look at what the constraints on the line are, the age of the line. There's a lot of aging infrastructure in Maine that genuinely needs to be replaced. And so that's what these kinds of open and transparent processes are attempting to do, is to tease that apart, understand what the constraints actually are, and might there be a better way outside of the narrow scope of poles and wires that the utility, that's their hammer, and they're going to hit all the nails with that. So we need to sort of tease that apart and understand the problems a little bit better to understand what's actually necessary. But we don't know until we take a close look.
Thanks, Rebecca. Tony here from Kennebunk Energy Efficiency asked, can cross-country wires be placed underground to avoid wilderness areas and urban areas? Steve, do you want to take that one?
Take a crack at that. I think the answer is clearly yes, it can. The question is at what cost? I know there's a big move to underground wires, including in places like Florida, and that have had a lot of outages from hurricanes and other things, as well as out west, where they've had a lot of wildfires. And so it's possible. It's expensive, and obviously consumers would have to pay for that. If any of you have been in Germany, you probably notice you don't see a lot of wires. They put a lot of stuff underground there. So that's a good example of one place where they're trying to do it. But it's just, it just comes down to cost and, how much people are willing to endure some outages. There's other strategies too to help recover from outages. And that's one of many.
Thanks, Steve. Let's see. David asks, does grid planning stop at the shore? What about offshore wind grid planning, and how does that source of energy tie in? Jack, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, David. I think one thing I'd like to share is that, just recently, 5 New England states, just with Vermont just sort of in an observing role for the moment, just put out a request for information from the public and from transmission developers about what are the best transmission solutions for integrating the large quantities of offshore wind that are already being developed in southern New England, as well as what's contemplated for the Gulf of Maine in floating offshore wind. There are a lot of different ways to do to plug in that power generation, some which will be more or less expensive or more or less disruptive, and have different impacts in terms of what the onshore transmission grid impacts will be and investments that are needed there. So I think part of the idea of this process is to sort of bring all of those things in. Like Rebecca said before, this is going to be an iterative process, because because you're needing to bring in like multi-state regional transmission planning ideas with the things that are happening in state in terms of like ongoing legislation or implementation of federal incentives like that are coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, actions of private companies, energy policy processes that are already underway in Maine. We can't sort of stop and wait for everything to happen in a certain sequence. So I certainly think that as that process, that regional transmission, offshore wind transmission RFI, and hopefully a joint RFP, like an actual request for proposals that comes out of that, certainly hope that that will be integrated in with this process as well, because the vision is to see how we can build a grid that can enable that transition of homes to heat pumps, cars to EVs, our generation from majority gas plants in New England to renewables like solar and offshore wind. But that's something that we're going to see. As Rebecca mentioned, this is going to be a long process, and one that happens sort of on a 5-year cycle. So we don't know exactly how long this initial stakeholder process will be. Once the PUC, the commission, directs the utilities to sort of form their plans with all of the requirements that they'll set based on this open stakeholder process, then they're going to have 18 months to develop that plan. And ideally there'll be some transparency within that sort of 1.5 year long period. But all of those things are where these different processes are going to be feeding into that planning process.
Thanks, Jack. Rebecca, I'm going to direct this next question to you. It comes from Susan, who is a homeowner with about 10 kilowatts of solar generation capacity. And she asks, what are the prospects for fairer treatment of grid-tied systems like ours in terms of billing and credits for net energy production?
Well, as far as I understand, the net energy billing program for smaller size rooftop units like what she describes will be consistent, will stay the same. What's being debated right now, and a proposal about which is forthcoming, is around slightly larger solar on the community sort of solar scale of 2 to 5 megawatts. And that's where there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what the programs will look like. But as far as I understand, the program for rooftop, which permits you to net anything that you output to the grid is deducted from your monthly bill, and any credits you have go forward for 12 months. And I don't know if others have more to offer there, but.
Anything else, Jack or Steve? No. Okay, let's move on to this question from Sharon, who asks, what is the plan to ensure that power available to Mainers is from green generation sources? Jack, you want to take that one? Or maybe Steve, either or.
Yeah, I can take a first swing at it. Well, we have here in Maine, we have what's called a renewable portfolio standard law, which requires a certain percentage of our electricity to come from renewable sources. Right now, those obligations are 80% renewable by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So that's laid out in statute, and we at NRCM and at UCS and many other advocacy groups that are on the call spend a lot of time thinking about making sure we have the amount of renewable energy that we need to meet those targets, especially as we see the anticipated electricity needs start to grow as people switch to electrification of home heating and of transportation as well. But the long story short is the plan is a law that was passed by the legislature in 2019, updating those RPS goals to 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050.
I would just add to that I think it's also just really important to make sure that there's procurements in place to achieve those targets. And there have been a couple of procurements that have happened in Maine that have been successful. At some point, we're going to need that for offshore wind pretty soon too. Given all the interest and development that's going on in the region and around the world for that matter. To the extent that we can facilitate those procurements and actually accelerate them, because now we have all these incentives available from the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits that are pretty valuable, that it makes sense to really accelerate that process and get this stuff on the grid. And as we know, New England is heavily reliant on natural gas still, and that's having a big impact on electricity prices. And so the faster we can do that, the more benefits will come from reducing that exposure to those prices and the volatility.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me to can't let an opportunity pass by to mention that over the past few years, the only thing that has brought down electricity prices, which was announced by the commission last summer or this summer, is those big solar procurements that we did. They pushed down the electricity prices by 5%. Now that got swallowed up by the price increases that are coming from New England's reliance on natural gas and the exposure that because of that we all have to geopolitical events and other other sort of big swings in the global economy, et cetera. But if it comes down to what is causing prices to go up, it's our dependence on fossil fuels, and what is causing prices to go down, it is it is our increasing procurements of renewable energy. So those are just the facts as they stand right now.
Thanks, Jack. Let's see, we have a few more questions, but some of them are getting a bit specific. I guess it's just a softball question, Rebecca. Gina was asking if she's able to find those CMP hosting capacity maps online and looking at our own region. Could you tell people where to find that?
Yeah, sure. I can drop that in the feed here. And if it disappears after the webinar, you can just email me and I'll follow up.
Great. Jack or Steve, do you have any last questions that you want to answer that you see here in the chat? Otherwise, I think we might wrap up, and I'll share emails again for folks to do some follow-up.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, I saw a couple of questions about some specific things like distributed grid services and demand response and green hydrogen and microgrids. And I think, this process doesn't predetermine any of the kinds of solutions that we might have for what are the most cost-effective investments, what's going to provide the most benefits at the lowest costs. It's possible that any of those things could be part of that mix. And so I'd really encourage people, as Rebecca said, to stay tuned. We're going to be reaching out certainly to everyone who is on this webinar and many others once there are those opportunities to participate in the process that we expect the commission to lay out here shortly. And so I encourage everyone to come and bring those questions and those ideas, because we're going to have a better outcome when all of that input is brought into this stakeholder process and what's laid out for the utilities in terms of what they need to consider and evaluate as part of this planning process.
Great, thank you, Jack.
I was just noticing this question in here from Seth Berry about who's going to speak for customers and the costs of making some of these improvements on the transmission and distribution side and interconnection side. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think obviously the OPA, Office of Public Advocate, could be one voice in that. we're actually hoping and been working on this through a separate proceeding at the PUC related to intervenor compensation to try to get more voices to the table to represent environmental justice groups, but also community-based groups to have more of a voice in the not only well in the planning proceeding that we're talking about right now, but as well as other specific proceedings that relate to this. So I think that's a important thing to do, as well as, you know, groups like ours, I think, can also speak for customers and advocate for the most cost-effective long-term solutions that also are going to reduce the impacts of climate change, which have a huge cost on all of us, as well as public health impacts from relying on fossil fuels. So all of those things need to be taken into account on the cost-benefit equation.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Well, we are coming up on 1 o'clock. One more big thank you to everyone who joined us today, and a thank you to Steve for joining us from UCS, and to Jack and Rebecca as well for sharing this information with everybody. If we weren't able to get to your question, or you have questions that come up after this, feel free to send an email to me. You should have gotten a confirmation email about the event, and I'll make sure to forward it to the right speaker. And like Jack and Rebecca said, stay tuned. This is going to be a long process, but there's going to be a lot of opportunity for public input, and we'll keep you posted up when those opportunities arise. So make sure you're subscribed to our email address, our email list, and we'll let you know. And again, just by coming to this webinar, we'll follow up with you there. But thanks, everyone. Have a good day. I'm glad you joined us today.